Hi, everyone. For those who just joined, my name is Qianqian Ye, the current lead of p5.js. Welcome to the p5.js Access Day. We have been talking about the event and the p5 and access in the opening session earlier. We're going to start the first session, Critical Web Accessibility, moderated by Kate Hollenbach. Panelists Luis and Jes will share their experience working on web accessibility for p5.js and assistive technology. We're really sorry that Cassie could not join this event. Let me start this session by introducing the moderator, Kate Hollenbach. Kate Hollenbach is an artist, programmer, and educator based in Denver, Colorado. Kate is an assistant professor of emergent digital practice at the University of Denver and serves on the board of director for Processing Foundation. Kate, take it over from here.
Thank you, Q, and good morning, everyone. I'm Kate, and to provide a description of myself, I am a white woman with short pink hair, and I am wearing glasses with blue frames and a white jacket with purple and pink flower pattern on it over a black t-shirt, and my background is blurred out. First, today we're going to hear from Luis Morales-Navarro, and Luis's pronouns are he, him, or el. And Luis is a doctoral student in the Learning Sciences and Technologies program at the University of Pennsylvania. His current research focuses on youth computational empowerment and studying novice programmer experiences debugging physical computing and machine learning powered applications. Since 2017, he has been contributing to the p5.js open source project, working on accessibility and the friendly error system. Welcome, Luis.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Q, for organizing this wonderful event. I'm going to share my screen and go over some slides, but feel free to talk to me, Kate, if there's anything that you would like me to chat more about. And I'll start by describing myself. I'm a Latinx white male that has long black hair and a beard, and I'm wearing glasses and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. The background is mostly white and there's a painting, kind of abstract painting behind me. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about p5.js and web accessibility, or what we have tried to do in web accessibility, because there is a lot of work to do. And I'm particularly going to focus on some of the ways that we've thought about web accessibility and the importance of infrastructure, so that as a community together, we can continue moving forward in trying to make learning with p5.js more accessible to more people. And I'll start by kind of highlighting some of the assumptions for learning with p5.js. And one of the assumptions is that learners have to know what a Cartesian coordinate system is, and they have to be able to orient themselves in a Cartesian coordinate system. And that's like that's a challenge for some learners. We also assume that learners can write, that they can type in. We assume that learners have an understanding of colors, and that they can bring that understanding of colors into then an understanding of color codes. We assume that learners have an understanding of basic shapes, that they can navigate the interfaces used to program with p5.js or to engage with p5.js sketches. And we assume that they can understand the output of a p5.js project. These are a lot of assumptions. There are probably many more of the things that we think that learners should be able to do to engage with p5.js and learn with p5.js. The problem is that all of these assumptions are also challenges for some people to actually have access. Not everyone can understand the output of a p5.js sketch. Not everyone knows how to navigate the interface. Not everyone has an understanding of a Cartesian coordinate system. And these are challenges that beginners usually encounter. Today, I'm going to focus mostly on understanding the output of a p5.js sketch and how thinking about screen reader users and people who are blind challenges the way that we usually think traditionally about a p5.js output on a web canvas. So one of the questions that have been asked many times by several people is p5.js accessible to people who are blind and visually impaired? And my answer is very simple. No, very few p5.js sketches are. But the community has worked to make some efforts towards making p5.js more accessible to more people. And that is actually what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about how over the past 5 years, many people in our wonderful community have thought through ways that we can try to make the sketches more accessible to screen reader users and people who are blind. And I'm going to start by sharing a story of how this all started. In 2016, Chancey Fleet, a blind technology instructor at New York Public Library's Talking Book Library, wanted to code a diagram for a banquet. She reached out to Claire Kearney-Volpe, and they started looking for tools to make a diagram. Yet they found that most of the tools out there were not accessible to people who were blind. Claire then reached out to the Processing Foundation, and the folks developing p5.js, together with Claire, started working towards improving accessibility of p5.sketches. In the picture, we see Chancey and Claire surrounded by other folks around a table. They all have computers, and they are participating in a web programming workshop. To give a little bit of context, people who are blind, like the people participating in the workshop in the picture, use assistive technologies, particularly screen readers, to understand what the graphic interface is of a computer screen display. So what is displayed on the screen? But to do this, the content displayed on the screen has to follow certain accessibility guidelines so that a screen reader can access it. For example, screen readers recognize images, but they cannot describe them. We need to add alternative text or image descriptions for screen readers to communicate the meaning that images convey to screen reader users. So Claire started working on adding alt text to the reference examples of the p5.js website. Actually, simple web content that is well written is very accessible to screen readers because it's very structured. But there is one web element that is not accessible at all, and that is the canvas element. And if you've used p5.js, the canvas is actually where p5.js sketches are displayed. They are displayed in the most inaccessible web element. And it is incredibly inaccessible because it's a collection of pixels, it's a bitmap, and the screen reader cannot tell you what the shapes are being, what are the shapes that are being displayed on the canvas and how the shapes relate to each other. It can tell you that there's a canvas, but it cannot tell you what is inside of the canvas, what is being displayed, what is the content of the canvas. So that's kind of the big challenge that a couple of people we've been thinking about. How do we make what is inside of the canvas more transparent to screen reader users? I met Claire in late 2016 when they were working with Mathura Govindaran to add accessibility features to the p5.js editor. And I joined them together, and with the support of wonderful contributors and advisors like Cassie Tarakajan, who couldn't be here today, Lauren McCarthy, Josh Mealy, and Sina Bahran, and Chancey Fleet, all of them who are accessible technology experts and who are also blind. We implemented 3 accessible canvas outputs: a text output, a grid output, and a sound output. The first ones describe what is on the canvas, and the third one kind of sonified the movement of shapes by changing pitch and panning. And we did this on the alpha editor. Back then, there was no p5.js web editor. There was an alpha editor. At the time, a lot of the people involved in the project, we were affiliated with New York University, and that was very helpful because we had time to work on this as part of our everyday jobs. We tested and improved the outputs. Claire was teaching an accessible tech class at the university, and that was also great because we could do user testing and involve students in the process of development. In the image on the screen, there is a screenshot of the accessibility settings on the P5 alpha editor around 2016. Then we started thinking that our efforts were limited to the editor, but people use P5 sketches in places other than the editor. And we wonder, how could we use screen reader accessible outputs outside of the editor? So Mathura Govindaran and I got a Processing Foundation Fellowship with Claire as our mentor to further develop the outputs and create this P5 add-on, which we called p5.accessibility.js. And this was an add-on that people could add into the HTML of any p5.js project to make the outputs a little bit accessible. This add-on worked doing what we call monkey patching, and that is going into the code that users provided and trying to like grab what the shapes being drawn were to then create descriptions out of them. So this was kind of like after people create their sketch, this thing goes in and tries to like understand the code and makes a description. Very basic descriptions for very basic shapes. And it was kind of like living with the other add-ons for p5.time, p5.js, p5.dom.js, and p5.sound.js. So kind of like a side project outside of the main p5.js library. By the time we finished the fellowship, none of us was working at NYU, and we couldn't dedicate that much time to work and continue developing this add-on on p5.js. But in 2019, as Hugh mentioned earlier, we had a p5.js contributors conference at the Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University. And that was a really important moment because it changed the way the p5.js community thinks and approaches accessibility. In this conference, the community decided that p5.js will not add any new features except those that increase access. At that conference, people like Claire, Sina Baran, Lauren McCarthy, Kate Hollenbach, who is here with us today, Olivia Michaela Ross, and Evelyn Massa. Together, we came together and kind of outlined a vision of what thinking about accessibility would mean moving forward. And that was kind of a vision of accessibility as something that is part of the community and that is centered in all the aspects of the work of p5.js. And in that same space, we started thinking about what we were doing about accessibility and how it might not have been like the best approach. Among the short-term actions, we identified the need for functions that allow users to write their own descriptions and the importance of merging the add-on that existed into the main library. That meant no more p5.accessibility.js because accessibility should not be an add-on. It should be part of the core library. And creating these two types of outputs that are accessible outputs that are user-generated, so outputs that you and I can write when we create our projects, and library-generated outputs that the library itself generates as it is creating shapes that are displayed on the canvas. And then through a Google Summer of Code, a lot of Google Summer of Code work with Kate Hollenbach, who you heard from earlier, we got to create these 4 functions in the main library that support some accessibility of p5.js sketches. 2 of the functions allow users like you and me to create descriptions of the canvas that kind of work like alt text in general web, and those are describe and describe element, describe being a function that generates a description of the canvas as a whole, and describe element, a function that generates descriptions of elements within the canvas. So you could imagine maybe you have like a heart and a smiley face. You want to have descriptions separate for each of them, but then a description describes how these 2 things relate to each other. And then the library generated outputs that create a text output, kind of like an automated description of what's in the canvas, and a grid output that matches what's on the canvas to a table so that screen reader users can navigate a table and get a sense of how shapes relate to each other in terms of position. These are all very limited efforts that mostly focus on basic shapes and basic 2-dimensional shapes. And there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to implement these functions in examples that already exist, but also to increase their reach into other types of things that you can create with p5.js, including like WebGL and all these other things that exist in the library already. But I'll talk a little bit more about kind of like the ideas that we had behind this. So I think a huge part of this was the idea that accessibility features should be accessible, and they should be accessible to the people that use them, to screen reader users, but also to programmers and also to contributors. So kind of like following the hashtags that are part of the community statement of p5.js, kind of thinking about no accessibility snobs. So accessibility shouldn't be a task of a few, but it should be a community endeavor. And that really made us think about how screen reader users use the accessibility features, how contributors learn about accessibility features and deal with them when they're coding, and how people who use p5.js can make their sketches accessible in easy and simple ways. And in guiding, I think a guiding principle behind this work is one of the principles of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is Principle 3, and it's about content should be understandable. Information should be easy to understand, and not only like accessible, but easy to understand and displayed in ways that the person using it can actually make sense of it. And that is something that I think kind of like runs across these three areas of screen reader users, contributors, and people who make P5 sketches. And really thinking about like that relationship between accessibility and community. So for contributors, one of the things that we did is we invested some time adding documentation and accessibility to the contributor docs. And that's important because one of the things that happens now is that the accessibility outputs are generated as the shapes are generated in the library. So accessibility features in the p5.js library are distributed across 21 different files, which means that if you change a file that might not be necessarily about accessibility, you will be affecting the way that accessibility features work. And there's actually a very funny story. About a year ago, WebGL broke in the library, and it was because of an accessibility bug. And that sounds incredibly unfortunate, but I was actually very happy because it meant that accessibility was kind of integrated into the system, and that a bug in accessibility could make the whole p5.js not work and put all of our community of contributors to think about how do we solve this issue in accessibility. So I actually think about that bug as a success of like, hey, we're being able to integrate accessibility across the way that that the library works. But also we need to think about how do we make accessibility accessible to people who use p5.js and might have no idea about web accessibility or the importance of describing web content. And that comes a lot through modeling how to use accessibility functions in the reference. This year, actually, we've had some progress from contributors that I did not know who volunteered and started making our reference more accessible by using the functions that already exist. Again, all of this with the idea that accessibility is a community responsibility, and that as users, as contributors, we need to make an effort to ensure that we're doing everything that we can with the features that we have right now to make our work more accessible. There's a lot of things to do. There's a lot of user testing to do, There's a lot of tutorials to write. There's a lot of reference updates that we have to make. There's a lot of learning materials to be developed. There is a lot of accessibility work that has to be done in the editor. And there's a lot of features that could be developed moving forward to increase accessibility in the library. But for now, you can use describe and describe element, which are two functions in p5.js, to make your sketches a little bit more accessible. And if you're interested, I really encourage you to reach out and to go onto the p5.js GitHub and contribute to accessibility work, or include accessibility in the ways that you're already contributing to this work. And the only thing I would say is that this is product of the work of a lot of people. So huge thanks to Claire Kearney-Volpe, Kate Hollenbach, Laura McCarthy, Mathura Govinder, and Chancey Fleet, Cassie Tarakajian, Josh Mealy, Sina Baran, Antonio Guimaraes, Elizabeth Beth, Mithu Vigneshwara, Josie Spira, Olivia Michaela Ross, Evelyn Massa, Toyun Choi, and Atul Varma. And I'll pass it on to Kate. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Luis, for sharing your work with us. Next, I'd like to welcome and invite our next speaker, Jes Daigle. And Jes's pronouns are she, her. And Jes has been in the tech industry for nearly 20 years, always striving to build impactful software and teams. Outside of tech, Jes is an advocate for kids and families affected by autism, with the goal always being to create the most inclusive classroom environment for all learners in the classroom. She has a deep passion for inclusive technology and using technology to challenge the bias and stigma surrounding disability. Jes, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. All right, so I am not going to screen share. I honestly just didn't have time to put slides together. My name is Jes. I am a white woman, red hair, pulled back in a ponytail because it's 1,000 degrees where I am today, and purple glasses. And my background has some quotes on the wall. One of them says, "Work hard and be nice to people." And on that note, Luis, your presentation was wonderful. And you really touched on a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about today. So it's kind of a nice segue. You know, when I got involved in the accessibility space, I wanted to understand how we got here. Why is it so hard to make accessibility just part of our process as software engineers and as developers? And one of the things I discovered as I dug in was that initially, ARIA was created because HTML5 wasn't accessible. So that was the way to kind of make it so. The initial draft came out in 2008, and it wasn't an official recommendation from the W3C until 2014. So if you think about that for a minute, that's a lot of years in between having a draft and having it be something that the W3C recommends that engineers out in the world use in their applications. And, you know, the rest of in the space of accessibility has kind of kept that pace, unfortunately. It's the one area in this industry that doesn't seem to move at the same pace as everything else, like P5. And so that is, I think, one of the challenges for folks that are trying to figure out, you know, how do I make things accessible, is figuring out how to get get that ARIA and learning that to include it in your application. ARIA is in itself relatively complicated. You know, you have roles and focus and all these different things that the screen readers use to render the content. And then you get into the complexity of the screen readers themselves. Some have interactive mode and reading mode, some do not, and you have to account for those as you go through. And what all of those different things introduce is occasions where screen reader users will say, well, if I use this browser and this accessible technology, then this web application or this website works just fine for me. But if I use something else, it doesn't. And so that led down the path of interoperability, which is a project that I've been involved in now for the last 2 years, which essentially the goal is to promote screen reader interoperability, meaning that how a screen reader user experiences the web and experiences all the things within it doesn't change depending on what browser and accessibility technology that they have. Obviously, that's a pretty big endeavor. We're still in the thick of it. And one of the goals, aside from that, is to also build it in such a way that software engineers can leverage the tests that we're writing and testing against to see if their websites and web applications are accessible. All that said, that is very focused on screen readers, and screen readers are not the beginning and the end of accessibility. And so as we all know, there's lots of other things that you have folks that, perhaps they can't, use a mouse or they can't use a keyboard. So how do you account for dictation? How do you account for all the other ways that people engage with the web? And so that's been an area that I've certainly spent a lot of time in. You'll never hear me claim to be an expert because I'm not. I'm still learning as I go. But it's certainly something that I've been thinking about when, approaching these projects and, thinking about accessibility. How do we make it truly inclusive? I think one of the things that has always kind of stuck out to me is, as part of in the spaces of the W3C, and that's the organization that makes these recommendations and that kind of governs how WAY and ARIA operate, is that there are all kinds of different specifications for different types of accessibility. And I often wonder if the splintering of that into so many different issues contributes to the problem rather than trying to solve it. To me, it kind of echoes what we do in society. We have, folks with disabilities are often, I think about my own daughter, and, she has special education and she has to go to a special classroom to access the different things that she needs. And I think often in this space in accessibility, there's always these buckets of different types of accessibility. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is how do we unify that? How do we make it so when we make something accessible to screen readers, it's also accessible to those who can't use a pointer device, or perhaps they have some other challenge. And so that's one of the projects that I've been involved in, is just kind of trying to think that through, especially in education. It's education is always striving to be what they call kind of least restrictive learning environment. And how do we make sure that the technology rises to meet that? And, I think that, technologies like P5 and lots of others out there that are striving for accessibility, it's such an opportunity to kind of really open the door to let everybody in. And, one of the things that I've tried really hard to do is to make sure that the people that the work that I do every day impacts have a seat at the table. Screen reader users, folks with different types of disabilities, all of those, anybody that could be impacted, because I'm not an expert as a sighted person. I'll never know what it's like to rely on a screen reader to access the information and to do the things that I do every day. So I want to hear from the people that do, because, I'm someone who is sighted, I'm prone to making assumptions. Well, I think that should work. Well, I don't know. Let's ask the person that it actually impacts. And so that's a part of the process too, when, making virtually anything is to bring everybody to the table and make sure that everybody's voice is heard. I'm really appreciative of P5's effort into making things inclusive, making things accessible. I think it's a wonderful thing to want to bring everybody in. It's a wonderful tool. I've certainly used it, and often find myself as a software engineer wondering, how would I share this with someone that is blind, with someone that has visual impairments. My daughter is not blind, but she does have visual impairments, and so there's that level of it too. So I am personally directly impacted just with my daughter, and trying to navigate the world with her. On that note, I am going to thank everybody for listening, and I will pass it back.
All right. Thank you so much, Jes, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. I'm going to start off the Q&A portion of our panel with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So first question I wanted to ask both of you was, what do you consider the biggest challenges in creating an accessible creative coding platform like p5.js or some of our many peers?
Maybe I'll start. I think that the biggest challenge, there are definitely huge technical challenges, but I think that the biggest challenge is creating a culture where accessibility is something that everyone has to care about, particularly in spaces where content creation is distributed, right? Like if you're creating a platform that allows people to create software, like making their own software accessible should be easy and should be and it shouldn't feel like an extra burden, and that's something that as designer of like this open source projects that allow people to create software that is creative, I think that we should also think about how do we scaffold software developers so that they learn about accessibility, and so that they create, when they're thinking about creating a project, they're also thinking about accessibility at the same time. Yes, there are huge technical challenges in how we create automated descriptions, in how even like we create ways for software or for code writers to write their own descriptions. There are challenges, but I think that the biggest challenges are in like community building and in supporting our communities so that accessibility becomes, or thinking about accessibility becomes, a common practice and not the exception, and not something that just the accessibility people think about. But I don't know, Jess, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think, recently someone that I know who is blind has been trying to learn how to program. And, I think one of the biggest barriers that they've encountered along the way is, if you write code, all about syntax and semicolons and all those things. And those, and how the code is structured and how many indents or tabs, however you set up your IDE, those really can be, quite a barrier. And because you can't, someone who is using a screen reader can't access that information as, sighted people can. And so I think that that is a barrier in and of itself. And, how do we create a tool that allows that to be less of a concern? Is there, could we, build a linter or something that could just kind of automatically format that? Because I think it's one thing to learn the concepts of programming and, learning a CSS or HTML or whatever it is that you're trying to learn. It's a whole other learning curve for someone who's using a screen reader to figure out how to structure their code so it doesn't break. Where do the divs go? If you put one in the wrong place, the whole page breaks. And if you can't see it and you can't reference where it is, then that in itself becomes a blocker.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Luis, go ahead.
Add something that when I think about accessibility in P5, I think that there's like these two sides, right? How do we make it more accessible for folks who have disabilities to create projects? That's one part of it. And the other part of it is, how do we make the projects that already exist and the projects that folks that do not have disabilities are creating accessible to everyone? So I think that it's like a balance of these two sides of like, how do we make the things that everyone is creating accessible, but also how do we create tools that are actually accessible so that folks with disabilities can also come in and participate in the process of creating software and expressing themselves with software. And there are challenges in both. There are like one of the, and I wish Cassie was here, who's the lead of the p5.js web editor, because there are incredible challenges with the frameworks that exist for being able to edit code on a web browser. And as kind of like building on what Jes was saying, kind of like how this were designed, assuming that you can see the code on the screen instead of navigate the code by listening to it. And that's like something that I think that goes way beyond like the p5.js project. It goes into like the infrastructures that we have for editing code and for how we think that that software should be navigated, or that code for software should be navigated.
I'm really appreciating how both of your answers point to like different parts of the process. One is just being able to see the output of the sketches themselves and knowing what the library p5.js might be capable of, and then also the process of writing code as two very different but related technical problems to solve in accessibility. So relatedly, I wanted to ask you as the next question, what do you see as the future of web accessibility and creative coding with P5? Is there any new research about accessibility that you'd like to see applied or incorporated into P5.js?
Go ahead, Luis.
You know, a lot of people, one of the questions when thinking about the description of outputs or how outputs can be more accessible, a lot of people think about machine learning and how the advances in machine learning can help or could help create more accessible outputs. There's research by Dana Gurari, who is at Colorado Boulder, that looks at kind of like the advantages and disadvantages and like how sometimes machine generated descriptions work and a lot of times they don't. So I think that it's like something to consider. I'm not too, I don't think that that's like in the near future for something like p5.js, but there's definitely very interesting research in how to create accessible descriptions of visual images that can use machine learning to do that, and that automation I think could be really interesting. I am kind of like in the camp of like accessibility is a community endeavor, and I think that what I wish we could do is as a community kind of like make it easier for everyone to describe their own work so that it can be kind of like immediately accessible. And again, there's so many other things that can be done, right? Like now our accessibility features support only very few parts of p5.js. 2D basic shapes. We can describe some of the movement. And there's a lot to do in terms of describing three-dimensional spaces, in terms of working to improve the descriptions that we're already generating. I think that one of the challenges with like automated descriptions is also how do you talk about like relationships between shapes? Those are like huge like technical challenges, particularly in an open source community that doesn't necessarily have like staff software engineers that are tackling these problems every day and being paid to do this as a job. So that's also like a huge challenge, is like how do we get people on board that think that this is important work and that want to participate in it and collaborate to make it happen.
I think, you know, when I think about the future of accessibility, my hope is that the bar lowers. I think that part of what makes accessibility such a challenge, and the reason that so many libraries, organizations don't focus on it, and it's strictly, you know, accessibility people, is because the barrier to entry to understanding how to make things accessible is so high. You have to understand the different ways that the screen readers render the information. You have to understand all the different modes and roles. And, you know, folks that have, as I have spent a whole lot of years, you know, just programming in general, it's a whole additional skill set that people have to learn on top of that, and then figure out how to make it fit, how to make it work. Oh, and does it work with JAWS? Does it work with VoiceOver? Does it work with NVDA? And, you know, even in the spaces where there are tools for developers to try to learn how to make things accessible, even entering those requires a level of understanding that not everybody has. And so my hope is that as we think about the future of accessibility and building a more inclusive web, that we also think about why the barrier to entry to doing that is so high, and work to lower it as a community. Because I think the easier we can make it, the more inclusive the web will become.
Thank you. Yes, I think these are great points that oftentimes I'm a teacher, and when I work with my students, they're often asking questions like, how can I learn more about this, or where can I get started? And there's so much information out there that it's not always clear what they can first do. So the next couple questions that I wanted to ask you are kind of shifting gears to think more about learning about accessibility, understanding that there may be different levels of experience with that in our audience today. So my next question for both of you is, how or where did you first learn about web accessibility, and how did you get started? And were there any resources that were helpful to you in learning more, or that you've recently found really helpful in your work?
We should start picking straws, Louis.
Go for it.
I will say that I started with ARIA. I started with, a Google search on accessibility, and I landed kind of inside the way ARIA, they call it APG, the Authoring Practices Guide, that has a bunch of examples on how to make different UI components accessible. That is certainly where I started. And it is where I still spend a great deal of time. There are also kind of emerging libraries that are trying to be with front-end libraries that are trying to be accessible, although those have not yet been vetted quite well. So I'm not really sure how accessible they are. And I think that's also part of the mystery is, it says it's accessible, and how do you know if it is or not? And so I've started there. I started a lot of the most recently in the last few years has been talking to screen reader users. Tell me what this is like for you. I build something and, I'll ask a screen reader user that I'm friends with to be like, would you mind looking at this for me? And, I learned so much from the insights that I gained from those conversations. One of the things that I learned was it's not just about, the navigation. It's also about the structure of the content. It's not just, where the content lives in the page, but how structured is it? That really is an important part of how screen readers navigate it. And things like that, things that I, as a sighted person, wouldn't normally think about. And those are the kind of what I call like the golden nuggets, really, I think, that have really helped me to up my skill set in accessibility is through talking to screen reader users and really understanding what I do really impacts them and learning from that.
Thanks, Jess. Before we turn it over to Luis, I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about what ARIA is, just in case any of our viewers aren't familiar.
Absolutely. So ARIA is from the W3C. It is basically a specification that you use in conjunction with HTML to make UI components accessible. So it has within it, it has focuses that you can assign, roles that you can assign that tell the screen reader how to render the content or when to focus on that particular element.
Great, thank you so much. Luis?
I think that I first learned about web accessibility at NYU's Ability Project, which is housed at the School of Engineering. And a lot of what I learned is from Clara Kearney-Wolpe, who's also a member of the board of the Processing Foundation. But again, as Jes was saying, as a sighted person, a lot of these things are about kind of like understanding computing systems from a perspective that you have probably never experienced before, right? So I think that the first like intro to accessibility for me was like learning how to use a screen reader, and seeing how different screen readers work in different ways, and how like screen reader browser combinations work in incredibly different ways and give you different kind of experiences accessing information. And once you start like playing with screen readers and browsers, you'll realize that it's a mess. Like it's a real mess. And yeah, I think from there, like my first kind of like experience with accessibility was like testing software on different screen readers and working with Chancey Fleet, who is at the New York Public Libraries in Clare, to learn and to test those. I think that one of the things that as sighted folks we have to strive and have to do is to bring screen reader users into our development work, and not only as testers but also as people that can help us engineer things together. And they're the work of like Sina Baran and Josh Mila, I think that has been incredibly influential to the p5.js community. Having Sina attend the p5.js contributors conference was also a great way of like working side to side, trying to fix the problems of not only the technical problems of like, I'm not being able to access certain description, but also the problems in the way the descriptions are made, right? Like a text description is not necessarily effective just because it exists. And it's not necessarily understandable. A lot of it is also about the content. Is the content, are you telling too much? Are you telling too little? How much of what your system is like displaying in alt text actually works for a blind person to make sense of this, and for people of different like levels of expertise. One thing is to work together with an expert screen reader user, and another thing is to work together with someone who is learning how to use a screen reader. So I totally diverge into like a completely different conversation, but I think it's really important that we consider like those different levels of expertise, and that testing plays an important part of the whole process. Because if we are not testing how our efforts on accessibility work, we might just be like trying to do work that makes us feel good without actually being useful to people out in the world.
Great, thank you both for sharing your learning experiences with us. The last question I wanted to ask as the moderator before we take some of the audience questions is, what are effective ways for web design and development instructors to teach their students about web accessibility?
I think the best way for someone who is focused on designing visual interfaces to learn about accessibility would be to use a screen reader and turn their screen off. That's certainly how I have learned a whole lot. But again, I don't claim expertise, because I think when you are very oriented to the visual, you don't necessarily think about what users can't see. And because, I mean, if you're a visual designer, then that makes sense, right? But to learn about accessibility and to understand how to structure a page, how to structure content, how to structure the different UI components that you might be thinking about adding to your application. The best way to do that, I think, is to use a screen reader and experience it for yourself and kind of get some guidance there. I work with a designer who not only creates beautiful visual designs, he also creates text-based wireframes, which is essentially a textual description of the design, so he can share them with screen reader users, stakeholders, clients. And it is, I always tease him and call him a genius, but it really is such a genius effort. And I think that has also helped all of us that work with him get better at what we do.
Thank you, Jes. Luis, would you like to share your thoughts?
I think the first step is to talk about it, right? There is a lot of people learning about web development and software development in general that never hear about accessibility in their coursework. So kind of like foregrounding that even if you're, as a teacher, you might not be an expert, you might not have the experience to like engage in accessibility work, but talking about it and like talking about the challenges that the designing accessible software brings, I think that already kind of like opens the space for conversation and opens the space for learning more about. If you try to go and like read the guidelines for accessibility are not designed for beginners. Um, they are difficult to navigate. They are a hyper technical um, language. But one of the places that I go to a lot is the Mozilla developer site, because they have for almost every JavaScript and HTML element, they have a section on accessibility. And they are very much updating it as the guidelines evolve and change. And they're a great place to find references to learn about and to like think about like the problems that you're facing and how would you address those in terms of accessibility. And I think it's a resource that a lot of people learning about the web frequently consult and look at. It just happens that the accessibility section is like something that people just like scroll through because they're just trying to get their like whatever function they're trying to use to work. But that information is there, and they've done a really good job at making that digestible to novices by providing examples, by like examples with code that you can like look at and implement, and by providing explanations and even history about how accessibility has changed and what are some of the efforts that people have done. So the Mozilla developer docs are definitely a place that I would recommend people visit to learn more.
Great, thank you both so much. I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience now. We ask that you type your questions in the chat. And I'd like to start with a question from Jordan Jackson, who asks, how have you developed relationships with expert screen reading users? And I think you've both touched on this. Jes, maybe I'll ask you to share your answer first.
Sure. Well, honestly, it happened at first by accident. I just happened to become friends with someone who was a screen reader user. And then as I was getting into these accessibility projects with the organization I work with, I started to advocate for an accessibility tester role inside the organization to add that voice to our organization, and was successful in doing that. And so that certainly has been a help. Lots of co-design processes, I'm a member of a bunch of different Facebook groups for screen reader users and testers, and I ask questions. There's all sorts of, different avenues to do that. Those are just a few that I've gone down that have been certainly really successful for me.
I would say that most of my experience partnering with screen reader users has been through the Processing Foundation, and there it's been from like teaching together to like having workshops and like supporting learners and like actually seeing the problems that people face, that particularly with Chancy Fleet, to like brainstorming and writing together about what things would look like. A few years back, we had like we started thinking about like where could this go, and we had a couple of we spent like 6 months with Sina Baran, who is a screen reader user and accessibility expert, writing kind of a proposal of the direction that the Processing Foundation should take. And that was very constructive to not only think about where we're at, but also to think about where things could go. A lot of these relationships I did not start myself. These were relationships that existed mostly because of Claire, who knew these people from her own doctoral work and had these connections that then I was kind of introduced to. But I think that definitely one of the things is like it's all about partnering instead of like thinking of like I'm going to provide you a service. It's really about like how do we design things together? How do we like learn from you? Because at the end of the day, you're the actual expert in using a screen reader. You're the actual expert in accessibility. I'm just like a p5.js contributor trying to like implement code that gets to a place where you want to go. And again, I think that kind of like recognizing that we are not experts is also really important in like giving space to actual users and listening to actual users and what they think is we need. That's really important.
All right. Thank you both. There are so many wonderful questions in the chat, but I think unfortunately, keeping track of time, we probably only have time for one more. So I'm sorry about that. I wish that we could discuss everything that everyone asked. I wanted to return to an early question from Erica Jean who offered a speculative question, which was, could there be another way to approach web browsing as a whole? And I know that this is a broad, open-ended question, but
we're coming to it. The metaverse is coming. You know, and I say that half jokingly, but also half not. I think that is, you know, I've been exposed to the Web3 space and, you know, what they call the metaverse and these 3D avatars. And I'm always asking myself, you know, how on earth do you make these things accessible? You know, because they really are so visually grounded. How do you make these things accessible? And I think that, again, that, you know, it comes up against that broader question of, you know, we as society, as, you know, and I don't think it's just the US, I think it's everywhere. Everything is so oriented around ability, not the lack of ability. And that is a whole other conversation. You know, grocery stores are not accessible. You can't go to a grocery store if you can't see what's on the shelves without someone going with you. You know, there are so many things in the world that you just cannot do without help from another person, because the world as a whole is not accessible. So do I think that there is a better way to navigate and engage with the web? Absolutely. Do I know what that looks like yet? No. And not because, you know, I think it needs to be so visually oriented, but I just have a hard time imagining, like, what is it? How people are going to live in the metaverse when they go on the web? What the heck is that? You know, like it sounds honestly a little strange to me. I don't know if any of you have an Oculus. I have one. And I used it for a little while and I don't use it. It honestly makes me nauseous. So I don't use it, but it's so visually rooted. And it's frankly a bit disorienting that I can't imagine spending like most of my time in that space, even if, you know, Meta could figure out how to make it accessible to folks that, you know, can't see whatever is 6 inches from their face. I think that there probably is a better way, but I'm not sure what that is. I think that they are trying to say that the metaverse is next, but I don't know about all that.
Yeah, I'm also hopeful that there are other alternatives to the future of the metaverse. Luis, would you like to share your thoughts on the question?
I don't know about the future, but I think that's something that definitely is happening and has been happening for like the past, I don't know, like almost 10 years, is the way that people navigate the internet through their voice, right? And voice and sound. And that is a very accessible way for people who are blind to access information by talking to a voice interface. And there's experiments with like people coding through voice, right? Like telling Siri like what goes next after something else. And again, like a lot of this of like, how do you go from like just like getting information of like what the weather is today or playing music to actually creating through a voice interface? That's like something that is not like a common thing that we're doing now. But I think there's a lot of space to think about voice and how you can create just by talking to a voice interface that can do a lot. I don't know. I don't know if that like sparks ideas, but we all have devices that can listen to us and can communicate back with us. And that's a space for really thinking about how like computer programming can look different. How can we talk about code instead of write code? And that's, I think that's exciting.
I think the hardest part with that question is that requires all of us who are so deeply rooted in what exists today to develop a new mental model of what it means to go online. You know, when I think about going online, I think about going to my laptop or picking up my phone or picking up my iPad. What does it mean to, you know, and I have Alexas all over my house and I only ask it, what's the weather? I don't really use it for a whole lot. So I think that's part of the challenge, is to rethink and kind of disconnect ourselves from what we have all become so attached to.
I also think that we've been talking a lot about web accessibility in a traditional kind of like following the standards, right? And especially focusing on screen readers and making content accessible and experiences accessible to people who are blind. But accessibility goes way beyond that. And when we think about the future, I think that kind of like going back to what Jes was saying earlier is, how do we think about accessibility in a much more holistic way, where we're thinking about multiple disabilities, and when we're kind of like imagining experiences and opportunities that allow people to contribute through different ways and to experience content in multiple ways depending on what they have access. Someone in the chat even asked, like, does the editor work on a mobile phone? And the answer is like, kind of. There's some work that has been done on that, but that's also kind of like thinking about access more in general, right? Like, what happens if you only have a mobile phone? There are very little opportunities to create software from a phone as it is right now.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll add, we have a version, like a mobile version of the P5 editor that has been started, but not quite finished. And this feels like a good opportunity to also plug that we currently have an open call for a new fellowship for someone to lead the p5.js web editor. And they'll be mentored by the current lead for the project, who's Kathy, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. So I would love to see some applications for this fellowship from people who have really exciting ideas about how to push the project forward, finish out some of these mobile features, and also think about the future of accessibility for the project itself. So I want to wrap up by thanking our panelists, Luis and Jes, for sharing their experiences with us. And we have some other great panels coming up today covering other aspects of accessibility, so please stick around.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Q.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for moderating. Thank you, Luis and Jes, for such a wonderful talk. We will take a 10 minutes break and come back for the next session, Disability Arts. During breaks, feel free to mute yourself, turn off your camera. We highly encourage you to share your posts about this event with hashtag P5XSJ, and feel free to tag us on Twitter and Instagram at P5XJS. We'll see you in 10 minutes.